Hi, I'm Garfield Benjamin from Solent University in the UK, and I'm excited to share this paper with fact on hashtag fuck the algorithm, algorithmic imaginaries, and political resistance. So the context of this work is that during the COVID pandemic in 2020, as with many countries, students leaving secondary school were unable to sit exams in person. And one of the prevailing priorities of the UK government and media for many years has been this perception of grade inflation over time. And this was at the forefront of their response to how grades were going to be assigned. Originally, it was going to be based on teacher-assigned grades, based on the work that students were doing throughout the year. But because this was seen to be likely to inflate grades too much, or more than the existing government would be happy with, they decided to ask Ofqual, the exams and qualifications regulator, to come up with an algorithm to define the grades instead. And the way this worked was that it ranked students based on the teacher's grades within their class, within their specific school. And it compared that ranking with the average grades of similarly ranked students from that school, from that class, in previous years over time. And what this did was it locked in students to their location, to their school, their particular area, their postcode, and entrenched historical biases. So students from private schools found that many of their grades went up because there was the expectation of success and historical success from that school due to the privilege afforded by those institutions, whereas many students from schools in more deprived areas found that their grades went down. And in fact, across the country, about 40% of students found that their grades were lowered based on the algorithm compared to their teacher-assigned grades. And of course, this had a huge knock-on effect for university entries, not just at the top end of people losing out on the top grades, but all the way down, people were finding they were not able to meet the requirements of their university places. And this, in turn, has sort of entrenched class issues, even racial issues, based on historical biases for defining people's futures. And so this was met with massive protests across the UK, as well as legal challenges from groups like Foxglove Legal. And in the end, the pressure from them and the media and society more widely forced the government to do a U-turn and use the higher of the teacher or algorithmic assigned grades. So to understand how during this protest the public perception of algorithms changed, I'm looking at it through the lens of algorithmic imaginaries. Now, Tanya Bucher describes this as users' understanding and experiences of algorithms in everyday life. But this isn't just knowledge, this is about the affective encounters. It's those moments that make us feel an algorithm is doing something, the moments that make algorithms visible. And people like Becky Kazansky and Stefania Milan have expanded this to talk about counter-imaginaries of activism. And this is not just making visible, not just making affective, it's making thinkable sociotechnical change. And so I'm using this framework to understand how the understanding of algorithms changed in the wake of the Ofqual algorithm and through the protests, and how that was then mediated through the phrase "fuck the algorithm" as well as online through the existing hashtag. So it's also important to consider resistance to algorithms. And I do this through, there's a range of different types or contexts or forms of practices that people have used, of course, to resist algorithms. So there's a long history of platforms being used to organize protests. Sasha Chock has written about this in great detail. Other people like Zeynep Tufekci as well have done a wealth of literature on these issues. It creates certain benefits as well as certain risks for those trying to organize physical protest using media, using particularly social media. Issues of surveillance, but accessibility, issues of rapid communication. During riots in London a number of years ago, various media were used to real-time say where the police were. And similarly, in the Black Lives Matter protests of the recent years, they've been used to organize locally as well as create this sort of broader narrative. Heemsbergen and others have taken a slightly different approach and actually talked about the tactical algorithmic resistance based on tactical media and the use of or misuse of algorithms themselves, but not just in a technical sense, but also in a social sense. And I think that's also relevant for these protests. And then there's Sarah Jackson, Moya Bailey, and others' work on hashtag activism and the way that the hashtag itself, as a form of online activism, helps us to create a certain narrative. It links in a current protest to specific histories of injustice and the fight against injustice. And so for me, the hashtag Fuck the Algorithm spans these practices in different ways, particularly as it changed through the off-qual protests. So the hashtag Fuck the Algorithm has much longer history on Twitter. The first one still visible is from 2011. And mostly these earlier forms were expressions of frustration at the content recommendation algorithms or content moderation. Either from the perspective of viewers, people seeing inappropriate or unwanted content and expressing their frustration at that, or as creators, the idea that they were not being seen, they were not being visible to either enough audiences or to the right audiences. And people also compared this across platforms. So people would go on Twitter to complain about the Instagram algorithm or the YouTube algorithm, and vice versa. And also we saw usage spikes around specific events, particularly when there was a noted change to the feed algorithms. For example, Twitter in 2016, where it made that shift towards the sort of top stories idea. And the algorithm took a more overt role in shaping what we saw online. That made it visible, as Tiny Booker would say. It made it affective. It created that experience of algorithms in a different way that changed how users understand it. It changed the imaginaries that surrounded algorithms in that context. And here we can see some examples of these forms of tweets. Sometimes it's used as part of a discussion. Sometimes it's used to add on to a discussion, to add that narrative. Sometimes it's even just used in reply by itself to tag that narrative in with the discussion that's going on. But also specific focuses on things like censorship and feeling like people were being made invisible by the algorithms. But then during the protest itself, we saw fuck the algorithm as a phrase, one of many phrases, one of many chants from the protest. But that got picked up by the media, got picked up on social media, and people started calling fuck the algorithm and hashtag fuck the algorithm as the future of protest. Overplaying it perhaps a little bit, but it captured the media imagination really as encapsulating what the protests were about. And some people were saying, well, it's not just about the algorithm, it's about other things. The algorithm itself was actually working as intended. The aim of the algorithm was to stop grade inflation, and it did that by entrenching historical bias. But actually if we contextualize this chant, it acts as a new imaginary of a whole range of issues. Alongside that were chants against the current government, the current prime minister, the current education secretary, all the people who are making decisions about the algorithm and the use of the algorithm, as well as slogans such as "students does not equal postcode" and various other things about the class and other forms of injustice that were being embedded within this use of the algorithm. And so while fuck the algorithm came about as this sort of imaginary of the event, it really did represent not just the technical object of the algorithm, but this whole network of social power relations. And the protest was against, fundamentally, this idea that it was shaping the possibilities, shaping the imaginaries, the expectations and experiences of people's everyday lives in the future, shaping their university options, shaping their job options, shaping their future lives. And it did this through making the algorithm visible, clearly, in the results, and we can see the number of students who had grades lowered as making this very visible, and also making it affective. This was an emotional response. The protests were filled with highly affective speeches and chants about students and their lives. And so it fed into this longer-standing idea of practices and imaginaries of resistance, using social media to organize and also using it to spread the message afterwards as well. And it got picked up by various news outlets, so it was largely on Twitter, but also linked to news articles and other media as well. And so through this, we see this shift in the imaginary not just as sort of something that tells us what content we have, although that obviously has socio-technical implications, but really as the algorithm was seen as this this medium for injustice, this socio-technical assemblage of decision-making, of power, of elitism, of media. And so the resistance was not to the algorithm itself, but to the decision to use an algorithm or to use this specific algorithm. And that's where also the legal challenges came as well. And so it made these, in making the algorithm affective, it also made these underlying political and social issues affective. It made people feel for the students protesting. And it also made the decision-making visible and allowed people to confront it in a way that worked. And then we can see in the way that it spread online afterwards that it was highly mediated, not just on Twitter, not just by the people there, but by reporters and journalists and academics as well. Now, after the protests, we see a change in the way that the hashtag fuck the algorithm was used online. We see slightly increased usage, having captured this public imagination. It saw greater usage across a range of topics, carrying on about being used about content moderation and content recommendation algorithms, particularly with the ongoing changes to those algorithms. But also, it was linked to other protests as well, other issues. There are examples of it being tagged into support for Palestine and perhaps this idea of tactical algorithms by designing algorithms differently in a way that helps specific marginalized groups. It was used in response to Twitter flagging indigenous protesters against oil pipelines in the US as content that should be moderated, that should be banned. And so it was used to protest this. So it kind of spanning both the content recommendation system and the wider political issues and the physical protests as well. It's also been applied to the attempts to ban facial recognition across policy, particularly in the EU. As well as issues like the finance issue of the GameStop example, where, again, you saw this mix of organizing online, in this case through Reddit, of people to protest the socio-technical assemblages of automated or high-level stock trading, and then against sort of this collaborative, collective effort to save the GameStop franchise by buying up stock and sort of tactically using the trading algorithms to stop the shorting of the market that those in power were aiming for. And so across these different forms, we see, in some ways, this sort of everyday resistance to algorithms. People even complained that every YouTube video now has fuck the algorithm as one of the first comments to come up. So people were sort of seeing it as, in some ways, kind of banal. But actually, it's to the way that algorithms define the banal. It's the way that algorithms define the everyday, the possibilities and the mediated reality that we see online. So we see this sort of broadening out in connection with these wider narratives, like we might see in #activism. I mean, here are some examples of those: Palestine, also the assigning of vaccines as well in Stanford hospitals. And again, people were saying around this that fuck the algorithm was going to become the future of protest, or how are you going to explain your algorithm when confronted with a mob yelling fuck the algorithm? And so across these changes and these examples, we can see that the hashtag fuck the algorithm wasn't new to the off-call protests. It was an existing hashtag with an existing imaginary about it. But it did come to mediate that protest narrative. It created a connection to existing practices, existing imaginaries, but also shifted them into this specific context and also the wider socio-technical sort of issues. And it became this kind of locus for these complex issues. As an imaginary, it became a symbol to latch onto, a symbol to express and make affective, make visible this fight for injustice. And across this, it was a widening of the future imaginaries, I would argue, for algorithms and for resistance to them by having this very visible confrontation with the use of an algorithm to perpetuate injustice. It created opportunities for considering more broadly and in greater public view how algorithms are used in society, who they're used by, who they're designed for. And so across all these changes, hashtag fuck the algorithm, I think, represents the ongoing shifts in our imaginaries and our understanding and our public perception of the use of technology and its relations to issues of justice, issues of politics, issues of social exclusion, and related issues. Thank you.